now that we have materials and colors added to our scene, it's time to set up our camera and render out this scene. Now this is kind of a thing that you have to tweak and change until you like the final scene. So we'll set up camera and see how rendering works, and then you can go ahead and spend some time change the material colors and stuff, and I'm going to do the same thing. Alright, so let's go ahead and start adding stuff. So we're going to go ahead and press Shift A to open the add menu, add a camera. Let's press 0 on the numpad and then press Shift tilde so that we can move the camera, and let's just move it out like that. Now, if you want to render the final images for your computer desktop, then this default resolution might work good for you, but I'm going to change that. So let's go to our output settings, and in our resolution, I'm going to go ahead and change this to 1080 x 1080. So because I want more of a square resolution for the final image. And for the FPS, I think 24 is going to do fine. And let's just change a few more camera settings. So let's go to our camera settings. And here we have this perspective. It displays our scene in 3D and it has this depth, but if we change this to orthographic view, then you can see that it removes that depth, and if we move our camera forward or backward, it's not going to really affect how the scene looks. So now we can just use this orthographic scale to change the look of the scene. So here I would just sort of recommend pointing your camera from an angle that you like, so just tweak around and play around until you're happy. So I'm going to just sort of tweak around and see what kind of angle I like for this. Okay, let's just place it like there, and I'm gonna just sort of fine tune this a tiny bit more so that I can get a bit tighter shot. Okay, let's go ahead and also turn on rendering to see how it's gonna look. Okay, now from here you can go ahead and start sort of adding and moving around these lights and other things. And another thing that you can do is that you can add one more sort of panel on the right here and turn off these overlays, and then you can change hide this toolbar and then enable the rendering mode in this viewport. So let's just do that, because that sort of allows you to see and work at the same time. And we can press 0 on the numpad while our cursor is here to see how our final render is going to look like. And let's just sort of adjust our view a little bit more like that. And then here you can sort of start playing around. So Shift D to duplicate, and then if you want to rotate, so let's just set our pivot point. So I'm going to go ahead and set that to 3D cursor. Let's just rotate this light a little bit on the x-axis like that, and maybe go to top view and move it closer to this area. And let's just switch that back over here to the median point and rotate. So you can see that this sort of area is being adjusted with this light, and sort of rotate and play around until you're sort of happy. So this is the kind of thing where it's going to take a bit of time to mess around and play with the lighting and stuff. So just play around until you're happy with the final result. And then once you're happy, you can go to this render window and start rendering your image. Now, before you do that, hide some of the things that you don't want visible in your final render. For example, these references, we can hide them in our render. We have the gaming chair, we don't want to see that in our final render. And if you have anything other that you want to hide, for example, if you have some sort of objects that you created copies of and you want to hide that in final render, you can also do that. And one more thing, in the render settings, you can move these samples down to like something like 256, and then slowly sort of move it up until you're happy with your final result, because 4000 I think is a lot of samples. It's going to take a bit extra time to render out. So let's go ahead and set this to something like maybe 256 for now, and we can do a quick test render. And also before we do that, I'm going to save the file in case Blender crashes. It often happens to me, so I don't want to sort of lose the progress that I've made so far. Okay, now that our file is set up, let's go ahead and render a quick test image. Okay, with 256 samples, you can see that it's going to take roughly about 20 seconds. It started around 29 seconds. I think that's good enough for rendering a single frame, because if we want to render animation, we have 24 frames, so that means 24 pictures or images per second. Okay, so here you can see that we have the final render image. If we enlarge that, now if you're happy with this image, you can go ahead and save it. You can see I can see some jaggedness down here, so I think I am gonna move my samples up a little bit. And once you're happy, you can go to this image menu and save the image onto your computer. It's gonna let you save or pick up the directory. So on my desktop, I have this folder called renders. I can just set this up and maybe type in something like render1, and then I can just save this image, and it's going to be saved on my computer. Okay, so here's the image that rendered out of Blender, and I'm pretty happy how it turned out. Okay, so we've rendered an image out of Blender, and now I want to render an animation of a moving camera. So the way I want to do this is that I want to sort of rotate this camera back and forth so that I can show the scene while camera sort of moves back and forth. Now there's going to be a really easy way to do this if we use constraints in Blender. So let's go ahead and do that. So first we're going to create a copy of this camera. So Shift D to duplicate and then right click to cancel the movement. Now in our outliner, we're going to double click here on the name so we can tell which camera is which one. So animated, I'm going to rename this to something like camera. So now we can tell that this is animated camera. Okay, if I can spell that properly. Now, when we add more than one camera in Blender, we have to tell Blender which camera to use for rendering. So that is called or known as active camera. And if you look, we have this gray outline around this camera icon, and it tells us that this is the active camera. So we want to make our current new camera the active camera, and the previous one we're going to just hide it in viewport and renders. So this new camera that we just created is going to be active camera and used for rendering. Now to animate this, we need a path along which we want to move this camera. So Shift A to open add menu, and then under curves, we're going to add a circle. Let's move this above the ground, and we're going to scale it out like that. And I just want to sort of align it to this center point of the camera. And let's just also sort of scale it down and move it down a little bit, something like that. Now for this camera to animate along this path, we need to reset its position, and the easiest way would be pressing Alt-G, and that's going to reset the position and move it back to world origin. Now with camera selected, we're going to go ahead and click on this tab here for constraints, and then under add constraints, we're going to click on follow path, and then we're going to select the target object, which is going to be this path, and this camera is immediately going to snap up there. Now we're going to go to our object properties, and then under viewport display, we're going to display our axes. So this is going to show us the local axes of our object. So you can see that Z axis is pointing forward and backwards. So now with our camera selected, we're going to go back to our constraints tab, and we need to configure follow path. So it says forward axis, that's going to be -Z. And then it says up axis, that's going to be our Y axis. So we can so in our object properties, when we enable axes, it displays the local axes of the object, and then for this constraint, we need those axes, so we can easily tell that Y axis is up, so that's going to be there, and then this is Z axis, so the -Z is going to be pointing forward. Very easy and simple. Now an easier way to point this camera towards an object would be to simply create an empty object, so Shift A to open, empty and plain axes, and let's move it above the ground, and we can scale it up so that it's easier to see, and then we can press F2 to rename, and we can rename it to something like camera target. Now with our camera selected, we can add one more constraint, and that's going to be track 2, and then for the target, we're going to select this new camera target that we just added, and just like that, this camera is now pointing towards that target. So now it doesn't matter if we move this camera, wherever this camera is going to be looking towards that target. Now with this offset value, we can move back and forth along this path that we have. So the final animation that I want to create is going to be something like here. So it's going to go back and forth. So let's set up our starting point. So I think I'm going to go with something like here. Let's start rendering so that we can see it a bit better. Like that. Now we need to adjust some render settings. So let's go to our output settings. And this time I want to render this as a wallpaper. So I'm going to sort of change my resolution, and then we can adjust our camera scale. So let's go back to our camera, and we can adjust the scale so we can sort of compensate for that. And then we're going to select our camera target and move it slightly above the ground. And let's just also sort of, again, I'm going to sort of select the camera and use this scale value to move even out like that. And let's go back to our constraints, and we can sort of rotate back and forth like this. So the starting point is going to be somewhere around here, so that's going to be like 20. Now the way animation works is that we go into our output settings, and down here we have our frame rate. Frame rate basically means how many images we want to play in a second. So all the videos that we see online are basically still images that are played really quickly, and it feels like it's a moving picture. So we have frame rates. We're going to play 24 frames. That's going to be 24 images per second. So if we need 3 seconds animation, so that's going to be 24 times 3, that's like 72. So if you want to go higher, you can also go more higher. down here we have our frames. So our starting frame is going to be 1, and then our ending frame is in this case going to be 72. But an easy way to do this would be simply typing in 24 and then times how many seconds do we want to play this for. So I'm going to play this for 3 seconds. So it's going to be 3 seconds long animation, and then we can press enter. And Blender is going to automatically do conversion and set it to 72. Now on our animation timeline, let's expand it a little bit. So here you can see that it's sort of highlighting a portion that we are going to be rendering. So let's go to frame 1. And we already set up our camera. So now we go into our constraints. So any property or value that you want to animate, you can add keyframes for them. Keyframes is a way of telling Blender that at this point, so in this case, it's going to be frame 1. We want to keep our camera at this position in our 3D world. So let's go ahead and right click on this offset value and insert keyframes, or you can use this keyboard shortcut I. So let's add that keyframe. And now on the timeline, you can see we have this diamond icon. So we're basically telling Blender on frame 1, we want to keep our camera in this position. Now we can go ahead and change the position of the camera to something like maybe around here. So that's going to be like 4. So now we're moving from 20 to 4, and we're going to move our frames. So how many frames later do we want to do this? So 72. So in total of 3 seconds, our camera is going to move from point A to point B. So from 20 offset to 4. Let's go ahead and type that in here. And now we want to add a keyframe. So let's right click and insert a keyframe. So now we have 2 keyframes. On this keyframe, we told Blender that we want to keep our camera at 4 for the offset. And then on this first frame, we told it that we want to keep it at 20. In this example, these values might differ depending on the type of project that you're working on. And now we can play back this animation. So you can click on this icon here, and it sort of lets you quickly go back and forth to start and end of your animation. And then you can use these controls for playing forward or backwards. So what I like to do is that simply hold click and drag it to the back, like frame 0, and press space to play. So I'm going to press space bar. So you can see that it sort of ends there. Now, instead of rendering the coming back of the camera like this, we can just reverse this video in video editing software, because that's going to be way easier to do instead of rendering 72 images again for going back. So in total, that would be like rendering twice our animation. So it's going to take twice as long. So in this case, it's just going to be a loop. A loop basically means repeating same video over and over again. So I think that's going to be much more easier. So now that we have this animation set up, we can go into our render settings, actually our output settings, and then towards the bottom we have our output. Now for rendering still images, we go to render window and render and then save out the image. But if you're rendering image animation, then you need to tell Blender where it has to store all those images. So we're going to click on this icon here. Okay, so now on my desktop, I have this folder called renders, and inside it, I created an empty folder called animation 1, and I'm going to accept that. So now this is the path where Blender is going to render all these images one by one. And then we have the file extension. We're going to make sure that it's rendering that. And then we have the file format. So if you're rendering something which doesn't have background, you want to render transparency, then PNG format is the one that you'll be using. In this case, we can select JPEG. And for the quality, I'm going to just leave this at default. It should work fine. So now that we have our start and end frames range selected, so we're telling Blender to render from frame 1 until frame 72, and we animated our camera animation between those frames. So it's going to render all these frames one by one. And we have all these settings set up. We can just render our animation. But before I do that, I want to bump up quality just a tiny bit. So we have 250 samples. I'm going to go to something like 400. And now we just need to start rendering and grab yourself a cup of coffee, because it's going to take a while depending on the graphics card that you're using and the complexity of your scene. Now this is a fairly simple scene, so it shouldn't take too long. But if we're rendering one frame in 30 seconds, then you have to like multiply that by the number of frames that you're going to be doing. So 72 means like, so let's say that we're rendering a single frame in close to 30 seconds. So we just need to multiply that. So 30 times is going to be like 30, and then multiplied by, we're going to render 72 images. So that's going to give us like 2160 seconds. And let's divide that. So we're going to divide that by 60. 36. So it's going to take like 36 minutes just to sort of render out 72 images. Quite simple. Let's go ahead and click on this render menu and then render animation, and it's going to start rendering. And if we look in the top left corner, it's going to tell us how long it's going to take. So each frame is taking close to a minute. So if we're rendering 72 images, that's going to be close to 72 minutes. So that's like 1 hour and 10 minutes. So we're just going to go ahead and grab ourselves a cup of coffee or do something else while this sort of renders in background. And then on the very left of this window, we have which frame is currently it's rendering. So now we're rendering frame 2, and then it's going to finish that, so you can see 46 seconds, and then it's going to do frame 3, and then it's going to keep repeating until we reach 72, or the last frame of our animation. Now, good thing about rendering this way is that if Blender crashes or you have power outage or anything like that, you can just keep note of the frame, like when you open the folder where all these images are going to be rendered. So if I quickly bring that up. So as you can see here, inside the folder where all of these images are going to render, we have 001, and as Blender is rendering, it's going to start adding more and more images here, and if Blender crashes or something happens, we can just come back to this folder and see how many frames we got rendered, and then next time we can go back to Blender, and inside Blender, we can sort of change this frame start to that frame wherever our render sort of stopped, and then it's going to start running again from that frame moving on. So that's a really good sort of way of telling. So you can see now it's rendering frame 3rd. So let's go back to that folder over the. So you can see now we have 2 images. So we have frame 1 and then 2, and now it's going to add 3, 4, 5, 6, and until our animation is completely rendered. Congratulations on completing this course. I hope you enjoyed it and learned a lot of new things. Until next time, goodbye.